in the link page to get.
Nice.
Yeah. Look, this framework is absolute bullshit. The first thing they say is that there's a role of the judge and that you are a journalist editor. You should declare this article absolute bunk. Our argument is that if you do not have a reason or a warrant into your 1AC that you can go for under your framework as to why your shit is good, i.e. impacts, then it means you will go negative on presumption. Also, they say that they don't have that you don't have to evaluate the impacts. This is bullshit. There's no other way to evaluate whether or not your rhetoric is good or bad, which is what you declare in your 1AC is the reason as to why you would vote affirmative in the first place, or what you should evaluate. They say the role as a journal editor, I answer this, how you should declare that this article is bullshit, but also you should just evaluate this in terms of an offense-defense paradigm. If we win a link to their criticism, or a link to the criticism of the 1AC or the 1AC itself, then it means we will win this debate. It means that if you don't have to evaluate impacts, this should work as a reciprocal burden for us as well. That means you do not evaluate any of their reasons as to why their shit is good. Also, they say that there's not a reason to publish a response. Our argument is that there is he says it's only a reason to publish a response. This is not good for us because it means if every affirmative was able to make this sort of argument, then it would mean that no negative could ever win. This is an independent voting issue for competitive equity. Also, he says that it's not the same thing. Our argument is that you functionally destroy any sort of ground that we can be able to garner inside the 1NC and move an entire speech for us. Also, they say that we're stuck in the moral high ground because we may, if we're trying to make these sorts of criticisms. But this piece, I think it's the Crowley evidence that he makes this argument. This Crowley evidence is not very good for them because this Crowley evidence actually indicts their 1AC as much as it indicts the 1NC. You should punish them for double turning themselves on the framework debate. The next thing they say is that there's no provision of a systemic action inside of the criticism, which means we will not win under their framework. This is another abusive thing for us. If they can claim that their alternative, or that their plan text is essentially the conclusion of their shit, then the alternative is the conclusion of our criticism of their shit. Also, they say that we're not able to resist under a critical framework. Also, this is not true. If we're just as critical oriented as they are. We're a direct impact turn to their shit. They say impacts don't matter, but they do in a world where we prove why you should not adopt their rhetorical criticism. They say that we're stuck in old models of domination. This piece of Crowley evidence is also another reason as to why they double turn themselves. This piece of evidence is a generic indict of the way the criticism works and the way the criticism works to impose domination on other people. This includes their rhetorical criticism that they have in the 1AC. They make these framework arguments hoping that they can get out of things like counterplans and dissents debate, but this is a criticism that we make of their specific shit. Links. First thing they say is that they can solve for the rash evidence, but no, you don't. The rash evidence is actually pretty good in talking about how the way that you posit humanity, i.e. your Butler evidence, sees humanity as a whole concept. Our argument is that you cannot do that because it declares an inhuman other. Otherwise, it would beg the question of who do we wage our wars against. You have to declare the enemy openly before you can be able to solve for that shit. This is what the hot tub evidence says. The hot tub evidence is pretty good in talking about how the only way to have a good democracy, or one that prevents the intolerance of the intolerant, is one that is radically open to intolerance. This is the agonistic model of politics that we're embracing, that we ask you to embrace. Either you have to be able to declare your enemy openly. They want to hide the exception. The rash evidence indicates that you will drive sovereignty underground and limit its potential for violence because we do not know what the fuck the sovereign is doing. You cannot get rid of the sovereign, especially when your framework arguments concede that your plan text does functionally nothing in the world, in your world, which means you will limit violence. The next thing they say is that you need to have a nuanced position, and that's what they create, but you do not have a nuanced position. You just erase a distinction that already exists in the status quo. The status quo would be better than your affirmative adequacy because it doesn't, because it at least allows for the position of opposition that is legally declared. Also, you have to have an open position to opposition, i.e. that you have to openly declare who the enemy is. The fact that their 1AC does not declare who the enemy is, or even declare that we will make enemies post the plan text or post their conclusion, means that we gain an implicit link to this argument. Even if you think that the permutation can suck this up, you should evaluate this in terms of the framing of the 1AC versus the framing of the 1NC and how open we are to declaring these people, certain people, as our enemies. Our argument is that this is the only way to be able to fulfill yourself, or be able to know who you are, is by recognizing who the other is and who you are not. This is the us-them distinction. They try to claim that they erase this distinction, but this is a functional link to us, a functional link for our argument. They say that their cleaner evidence indicates that we are able to escape the capital T truth, but this argument gets you nowhere. Our argument is that you have to have that plurality of associations rather than having the universal rights framework or universal universalizing rights, which is what your Butler evidence says you do in order to be able to solve for that shit. When you universalize a rights system or a rights regime, then it only means that you enact, you destroy your capital T truth in the first place. Also, the affirmative fixation on this shit only on the rights making a rights regime makes all exclusion of life possible. This is an internal link. Turn to their 1AC called 1-4. A sovereign power that acts in the name for good and for life that is defined solely by its belonging to humanity is a power that has become global. National life and international life constitute and exclude one another as the ground of the sovereign exception in the international world. The ground of the sovereign decision is humanity as such, and what sovereignty decides the status of that humanity is the boundaries of the nation state become more porous. Sovereignty has the power to determine boundaries, becomes more pervasive, and the status of life becomes increasingly precarious. Life across the globe exists in a state of crisis, subject to a sovereign power to itself and determine this instrument of sovereignty increasingly ranges over all territories and peoples, over humanity as such, and rights granted an individual depend on the spectacle of humanity, which gives us another link called Law 2004. Contemporary claims to enforce human rights grounded in individual dignity instead produce to depend on raw spectacle of humanity. We must separate sovereignty from the liberal vision of power as form, consent limited by power, by law and rights as sovereignty expands beyond the nation state form and increasingly operates by sovereignty form of sovereignty operating according to the logic of the exception rather than the law applied to material life rather than the juridical life and moving within a global terrain now almost exclusively biopolitical. And next thing they say is the Odysseus evidence is only the status quo. This is not true. The Odysseus evidence is describing the way that the war on terrorism has happened, i.e. that we tried to hide who the enemy was and wage a war in the name of humanity. Our argument is that we have to destroy the concept of universal rights in order to be able to establish that the sovereign is the only one that can decide on the exception. Our argument is essentially exceptions good, i.e. that we have to make them and that the making them is absolutely inevitable. This is the reason as to why you should prefer our argument as how if we win the enemies are inevitable, it means that we will control the uniqueness direction on this question. It means that you should create the enemies and openly declare them so you don't drive sovereignty underground. Also, the impact evidence that we read, i.e. the strong evidence, makes a good comparative analogy in saying that we have to be able to exist in the state of war at times in order to reduce the overall amount of violence. This is a distinction between the limited wars of the way we operate and the limited wars that can be good and of the politics of enmity that are inevitable and the wars of annihilation that they produce by having the universal concept of rights. The next thing they say is that they impact turn. It's only an impact turn of the app, but yeah, well, exactly. It's an impact turn of the affirmative. And even if they win, that their impacts do not fucking matter. They still have to win a reason as to why you would vote for them. Then, otherwise, you would vote negative on presumption. The next thing they say is that it's only based on ability, and that's a reason to prefer the other permutation. But this is not a reason to prefer the permutation. Rather, it's a reason why you should prefer the 1NC because we openly declare that we have enemies. The next thing they say is that we do not access strong evidence. Yes, we do. The strong evidence is pretty clear in talking about how your universal conception of rights are necessarily indicative of and make possible the most furious forms of genocide. The next thing that they say is that it's not descriptive of them. This is their Butler and 04 evidence, but Butler is wrong. Butler assumes a universal conception of rights. This is exactly what your 1AC Butler evidence says. It's not a good distinction for you. Also, you say that Schmidt is incorrect because of its conception of rights. Schmidt is incorrect. Our argument is that Schmidt is not incorrect. Rather, the friend and enemy distinctions are real and operate separate from the economic and moral considerations. This is Schmidt in 96. Friend and enemy concepts should be understood in the concrete existential space, not as metaphors as symbols, mixed and weakened by economic, moral, and other conceptions. It was one of its typical dilemmas of intellect and economics has attempted to transform the enemy from the viewpoint of economics as compared to the intellectual point of debating the average in the domain of economics. There are no enemies, only competitors in materially a moral, ethical world, only perhaps only debating adversaries. This is another reason why I don't prefer the permutation, because you have inside this argument makes the comparison that even inside of debate we have to have some sort of conflict for you to evaluate. The next thing they say is they only create zones for the affirmative. They create a good distinction, but your distinction sucks because your distinction erases the distinction that exists inside the status quo. Rather, we have to be able to openly declare who the enemy is in order to be able to solve for it. The next thing they say is that Schmidt establishes the exception that undermines possibility, but this is not true. Schmidt opens the possibility of pluralism, i.e. that the sovereignty is open and radically accepting to all possibilities of enemies, which means that we are able to understand the friend-enemy distinction, the way politics works. They say strong sovereignty relies on terrorism, but we need to have that sort of strong sovereignty in order to be able to understand how pluralism works. The next thing they say is it justifies strong state. This is good, essentially.
Okay, can you explain your responses to these claims? I guess your argument that answers are contextual analysis of Guantanamo is that sovereignty should remain open and that's able to solve these patterns, right? Is that what it is?
That sovereignty should be seen and they should be able to decide on who the enemy is, yes.
Okay, so where do you read evidence that says that the sovereign in this instance is good? like that this exceptional status of the sovereign is a good thing and is not. You know,
that is actually most of the evidence inside the 1NC. The first piece of evidence indicates that we have to have that sort of decisionism in order to be able to understand how politics works. It's also indicative of saying that since enemies are inevitable, i.e. that exclusions are inevitable in any sort of category, we still have to have somebody that is able to decide
so
on
enemies
the
are
primary
inevitable.
exclusion.
Why is this pattern of inevitability eliminated by human rights claims?
Our argument is that it's not that you eliminate enemies, rather you drive the way that we understand who the enemy is.
We just get to claim them less.
You erase a
They're less
distinction
frequent.
according to the conclusion of your 1AC.
Right.
You
Right.
get rid of the
I
distinction
understand-
between lawful and
I understand we
unlawful
eliminated
combatants,
the
which
distinction
drive
of
sovereignty
lawful and
underground as the
unlawful
link.
combatants. My question is, why is the label unlawful combatants a prerequisite to determining who is and is not an enemy?
Because it's a good distinction to understand who the enemies
Because
are.
it is-
Our argument is that we should label them as
Is your-
enemies.
Hold on. Is your argument that lawful enemy combatants are not enemies? Is that what your argument is? That soldiers
My
are bound to the state
argument
are
is
not
that the
enemies?
1AC does not posit an enemy, or does not posit the
So
establishment
it's
that
just
we
a
do
link
have
connection.
enemies. I mean,
It's just
part of it.
because
Also, it's a link of your universal conception of rights, i.e. that your Butler evidence indicates that we should be able to universalize the rights framework.
I mean, I guess I just don't understand.
I mean, maybe-
because your claim within these rights evidence is talking about how when we get all hippy dippy and say everybody should be human, and then as soon as somebody does something that is not human, we attack them and kill them.
No, this is
that-
exactly
I mean,
the
that's what-
criticism of the rights framework is.
No,
We say
that's
that
what
when
the
you
Odysseus
have-
article is talking about.
No, the
But-
Odysseus article
yeah.
is talking about.
Whatever. I'm not going to get into battle semantics, but
Whatever.
So your argument then is just that we cannot have rights claims, then, right?
We should not be able to universalize rights claims, which is what your Butler evidence
So
says.
there should be certain people that have rights and certain people that should not have rights.
Citizens should have rights, non-citizens shouldn't. Yes, this is exactly the distinction we are making, i.e. that we should protect national sovereignty above all else.
Do you read any evidence that the war on terror will be limited war?
Well, the Odysseus evidence indicates that it's unlimited now because there's no distinction. We have to openly declare it. That's exactly what the alternative,
Right,
the hot tub evidence
but
indicates that
isn't the
allows
war
us
on
to access
terror
that.
caused by that sort of like human rights, like America is freedom loving, Islam is evil?
No, it's a war on abstracts.